Hi, my name is Mary Quinn. I'm chair of the Wilson Wetland Stewardship Committee. And that's a mouthful, so from now on I'll be saying the Wetland Committee. The other members right now are Ann Carey, who is all the way back there. She's the head of the Conservation Commission. Jane, who are you? Over here. Jane's right here. Jane's on the committee. And so is Cynthia. Over here. Over there too. There have been many, many other people who have served on the committee. So, and we were started in 2012. And why it was started was in 2012, the town of Putney acquired 26.6 acre property from Polly Wilson, which is now called the Wilson Wetland Preserve. It was mainly funded by donations from community residents to ensure that the land would continue to provide wetland wildlife habitat, upstream flood water storage to protect the village center, and clean water for the town wells aquifer. The select board appointed the Conservation Commission to manage the property, and they then formed the Wetland Committee to actively oversee the preserve. So here we are, coming forth to today, this many years later. In 2022, Ann Carey found out that there was a grant available for flood resiliency. And Ann is good at finding those kind of things. And so we applied for this grant. Now the grant is from the Vermont Emergency Management Flood Resilient Communities Fund. It was established for building watershed resilience in the face of climate change. The grant was established by the Vermont legislature and funded by American Rescue Plan money. Now, there were eligibility requirements, and in addition to reducing flood risk, I'm reading because I want to get the terms correct. The projects must have the co-benefit of improving water quality. So many of you may know that the town's well is on that property. The town, via the wetland, specifically Ann and Jane, applied for what is called a project scoping study. Now what does that mean? Project scoping is a method used to develop applications for future rounds of FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. That's actually project scoping for this grant, with a focus on project development for the annual Building Resilient Communities Program or for other flood risk reduction grant programs. The study area that we chose was the Sackett's Brook Wetland Complex in Putney, which provides 1/3 of the water for Putney's water system. Specifically, the area extends from just above the Putney Central School, following Sackett's Brook all the way down to the dam behind the general store. Luckily, the town was awarded the grant of $31,500 in 2022, and the Wetlands Committee was appointed by the Select Board to oversee the administration of the grant. So after we received the grant, we had to figure out who were we going to hire. We had to hire a professional organization to evaluate Sackett's Brook Wetlands' functional ability, including evaluating flood protection, public water quality and quantity. They were to recommend strategies for improving function of Sackett's Brook and the flood storage for improving floodplain access. The committee also wanted them to include wetland habitat. So that was very important to all of us, since that's one of the reasons why we started in the first place. So we received applications from 3 professional organizations. Fitzgerald Environmental Associates from Colchester, Vermont were chosen. Now that's another mouthful, so I'm going to say FEA from now on, so when you see it, I'm talking about. So what tonight's meeting is about to learn about 3 alternatives chosen out of 11 alternatives for study, which were proposed to us by Fitzgerald. The committee presented the chosen alternative to the select board in November of last year for their approval, which was granted. So I'd like to introduce Evan and Rodrigue. You want to come into the line here? I'd like to, Evan Fitzgerald. This is right from the biographies on the website. So I'm definitely going to read this. I didn't say the whole thing though. Evan Fitzgerald is a principal hydrologist, geomorphologist with 20 years of experience in the field. Evan founded FEA in 2006. He has extensive experience with development of watershed-based restoration plans. He is also involved in flood recovery efforts on behalf of state and municipal clients. He is experienced with stormwater, rivers, and wetland permitting regulations at the local, state, and federal levels. And here we have Rodrigue Spinet. He's a senior wetland scientist / environmental engineer. He is involved in wetland surveys and delineations in a variety of settings, field surveys involving high-resolution GPS data collection, geomorphic assessments, and various stream and wetland restoration projects. Evan and Rodrigue have prepared a 45-minute presentation on their study and their findings. What you will hear from FEA will be their methodology, the 11 alternatives that they presented to the town, and the 3 alternatives they requested to be chosen for more in-depth study. Following the presentation, we will have about an hour for questions and comments from people in this meeting. So we can just do the presentation first, and then Evan and Rodrigue will be open for questioning. And you can question us too if you like. After following this presentation, this is for them, they will finalize the report for the town, and what they're going to take from this presentation are the comments that are made here and incorporate them into the town, into the final study. Then the town will receive their final report. Then it's all on our backs, and we will be reviewing comments from the public. The select board will choose one alternative as is required by the town, by the website. Excuse me, I'm on the wrong line. We'll choose one alternative which is as required by the grants. So I want to stress that the decision to study these 3 proposed alternatives does not imply a preference for any of them, either by the committee or the select board. Your input is very important to us. So filling out the comments cards will be very helpful. You can do that here. You can do that on your own time and put them in the box outside of town hall. There's a lockbox, or there's a Gmail address on the bottom that you can send your comments to. The committee will compile all the comments and it receives into a document. This will be presented to the select board. At the end of the process, the select board will choose which alternative to go forward with. So, Evan and Rodrigue, it's your turn.
All righty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. And great turnout. Wow. We didn't anticipate quite this turnout, as you can see the number of handouts that we printed. So apologies that I think we only printed like 12 paper copies. So if you guys are willing and able to share or look over one's shoulders, that would be great. The handouts are also going to be up on the screen in a little bit. They're the 11 alternatives that Mary referred to a minute ago. So you can hear us okay and see us fine on the camera and everything? Good. Okay. So again, I'm Evan Fitzgerald. We've got about a 45-minute agenda here. I'm going to give a quick introduction of the project and then pass it along to Rodrigue, who's going to get into the baseline conditions assessment. Okay. I just want to reflect for a minute on the project and our experience working with the committee, which has been great. These planning studies, I often think of them as kind of a journey, right? We start out knowing very little about the study area. We really have to learn about it in depth and really become intimately familiar with the ecosystem and, of course, the people who are part of that ecosystem and have a stake in the outcome. And then we, as Mary described, we go through our work and we try to funnel on down to, an alternative or two. That's really the challenge often in these planning studies. But along the way, we interact with you all and the committee, and that's been a really great experience to bounce these ideas off of them and hear what they know about the project area, which is deep knowledge, really, and many years looking at this. So it's been great working with you all, and we're excited to share what we found and share what we landed on. So I know this is really small text, so I'll just, and maybe the background, you can't see it. So we're going to go through, if you actually looked at the report, you'd see there's quite a bit of baseline conditions assessment summary. So what did we study on Sackett's Brook and the wetland complex of the Sandhill Road itself? We studied the hydrology, the geomorphology, the wetland ecology, and that's what Rodrigue's going to really dive into. And then we'll come back and talk in detail about these 11 alternatives that you've got a table of there and a map, hopefully. And then we'll really dig into the 3 chosen alternatives and kind of look at those very closely, both the pros and cons of the project and the costs. So with that, and I'll just say before Rodrigue starts, Mary listed quite a range of interests and objectives of the town, right? And that it's a good challenge for us, right? And so I just wanted to list kind of the key objectives that we were focused on in this study. So flood resiliency of Sandhill Road, the grant funding itself, the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. It's really a focus on flood or erosion vulnerability, reducing that vulnerability of infrastructure. But of course, all these other things we think about around infrastructure, the natural ecosystem and the natural processes are very intertwined with that, right? And related to that vulnerability. So we also studied Sackett's Brook, the channel, its morphology, its hydrology, and its floodplain connectivity. And then of course, the Wilson Wetland Committee is very interested in the wetland ecology itself. So with those 3 objectives, we're really spanning quite a range, right, of interests. And I think the alternatives you'll see reflect that wide range of interests.
Thank you, Evan. So what I'll be discussing next is the baseline conditions assessment that we did of the study area, which, as Mary said, spans Sackett's Brook and its valley from just north of the Putney Central School all the way to the dam next to the general store. So the data, there's a lot of data gathering that happens as we're developing a baseline conditions of a study area. Some of the data that we're gathering comes from databases or publicly available to anyone and might include things like soils data, topography, hydrology data, streams and tributaries that we can tell based on topography where they're entering different parts of the watershed and connecting or discharging into Sackett's Brook. We look at mapping that has been done by the state and other organizations of wetland areas or different habitats. And so that's one portion of all the data that we're sort of collecting on our computers and loading into software where we can overlay everything onto one map and sort of make sense of what we're looking at over the whole area. And then the other component of what we're gathering is field observations. So back in November 2022, myself and a team at FEA came and we collected data in terms of soil with a hand auger, sort of, traveling through the valley and the banks of Sackett's Brook and looking at soils, making measurements of what the channel morphology looks like at different sections as you go from the northern part of the study area down to the southern part. Trying to get an understanding of what sections of the valley have good accessible floodplain and what parts are not as accessible, where the beavers are very active, where they're not. And, so what I'm showing here is sort of the study area on the left-hand side with Sackett's Brook shown in pink. The Wilson wetland is shown in yellow. And then on the right-hand side is the whole drainage area that contributes water to Sackett's Brook as it enters the study area.
Point of clarification, what does the AC stand for on that?
She said, what does the AC
C stands for?
Right.
She's looking at acres.
Probably acres.
Oh, acres. Yeah, sorry. Right. So so each of so the coloring on this image is distinguishing the sub-watersheds that make up the whole Sackett's Brook watershed. So in dark black is the outer limits of the watershed. And then Sackett's Brooks, the downstream end is over here. And if you track it all the way up, it ends, the headwaters of Sackett's Brook are up here.
I can't see your cursor.
Oh, you can't? Okay. So here's the dam and the general store. This is the study area. The Putney Central School is around here. Here's Westminster Road.
Here,
And then
I just
Sackett's
got you a laser pointer on the,
okay.
there you go.
Thank you. Okay, and here's Upper Sackett's Brook. So that's the beginning of it, and this is the end of it within our study area, and the Connecticut River's right here. Okay, but as you travel from the higher elevation down to the lower elevation, waters from other sub-watersheds are also discharging their water into the Sackett's Brook. So you've got one sub-watershed right here that enters Sackett's Brook there, another one over here, and a third one over there. And the reason we went through that exercise is to understand how much water, since this is a flood resiliency, wetland ecology type of study, we have to have a really good understanding of how much water is flowing through this study area. How big the flows get and how frequent are floods happening. And so how large the area that's feeding water to the Sackett's Brook where we're having issues is a critical piece of information that we need to gather. And so I want to encourage, we kind of have to move through, fast through this information, but anyone who's really interested in this topic, as I'm sure you all are because you're here, I would encourage everybody to read the report and sort of take your time to run through this information. So this is an example of the total area that we looked at and then focused on a study area within that whole area. And then this is a slide that's sort of showing the kind of data that we collected as we traveled across the study area. So we've got little symbols for beavers. We took measurements of where the culverts were in Sand Hill Road. There's 5 of them. We took measurements, elevations of the culvert inverts, where the water comes in and where it leaves on the downstream side to understand what the slope of the culvert is and what water surface elevation is necessary before the culvert actually is conveying water. We took measurements of the bridge. Where's the lowest chord of the bridge, where the water would start hitting the side of the bridge? What was the top chord of the bridge? We took measurements of the dam, and then we took some elevation measurements throughout. And this information, we mapped it, and we also used it to develop a hydrological model and a hydraulic model of the study area to understand where the water's going, how much water is traveling through different areas, and at what velocity. Okay, and then another component of the study was understanding how this fits in with the wetland ecology and the habitat within the whole study area. And what I'm showing here is mapping, which is available, that's done by the state, and the state has different categories of mapping. There's mapping that's mostly the product of people reviewing aerial imagery and have some knowledge of what wetlands look like from altitude or satellite imagery. And they sort of make a best guess of where the wetlands are, and that's what's shown in the green on this image. And then some mapping is based on a combination of that, but also people sort of, observing the landscape in person and actually doing a more rigorous wetland delineation where they're looking pretty closely at what plants are growing in different places, if there are signs of water saturation or ponding or other indicators that would really tell any observer that, yes, there is a wetland right here. But I guess what I'm trying to convey with this image is that if you just trust the state and the basic mapping that they're doing of wetlands, just looking at aerial imagery and a few other parameters, you can tell that a lot of the Sackett's Brook Valley is a wetland. And wetlands run a spectrum from wetlands that are very wet, that have standing water for a prolonged period of time, to wetlands that can be pretty dry and that you can walk in totally fine and not get wet from, starting in August, for example, when it's typically drier. And so anyone who's been on Sand Hill Road, will have seen that, north of Sand Hill Road on the eastern side, you've got a body of water that tends to pond a lot. So that would be sort of an open water, more marshy type of wetland. If you're further west from that area, it's more shrubby, more emergent grasses and cattails. The Wilson wetland is more of an alder shrub wetland, a lot of alders and willows. But a point of this is that a lot of it is just wetland of one type or another, and quite functional. Okay, now I want to spend a little bit of time looking at aerial imagery, black and white imagery. So land use has a very big impact on all the things that we were charged to look at for this study. Land use can affect habitat, obviously. Land use can affect hydrology. Farming practices often involves tile draining, channelizing of small streams on the edge of a field, building a berm on the edge of a field so that that field doesn't flood. So understanding what conditions are now, to really understand why conditions are the way they are now, you have to look back in time and think about, well, what was this land used in the past for? And so for the study area, we were quite lucky because we were able to go back to the 1950s and we have black and white imagery, which, although it's grainy, it still has enough resolution that you can kind of tell what's going on. So on the left-hand side, I have a 1951.
The years of those, it's covered up by the.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know why that is
1951.
doing that. but-
Yeah, so this one is 1951, and then this one is 1977.
Thank you.
And then when I went through these images, I sort of pointed out things I was seeing. So Sand Hill Road is right here. This is Westminster Road. And here is Sackett's Brook. And what I what I think I saw from this picture is that most of the land that was west of Sackett's Brook was farmed. You know, this looks like hayfields, meadows, all of this looks farmed. Where this open water area, Sand Hill Pond is, it actually doesn't look like it's holding water in this image. And then the Wilson wetland looks to me like a shrubby wetland. And then the other thing I really noticed is there seems to be a lot of drainage patterns on the western side of the valley, right through this area. So you've got a lot of water obviously traveling through Sackett's Brook, but there also seems to be quite a bit of water kind of flowing southward on the western side of the valley. And then if you fast forward to 1977, the other thing I noticed is it's kind of hard to see Sand Hill Road on this image. And then if you fast forward to 1977, I'm seeing the road quite a bit better. And obviously some of this could be, well, the imagery might be a little bit better resolution, so maybe that's why I'm seeing the road better. But it seems to have more definition. Sackett's Brook hasn't moved a whole lot. The land use might have changed a little bit. This doesn't seem as bright as it was in the 1950s, hard to say. And then the drainage patterns on the western side of the valley seem to have a little bit of discontinuity right where Sand Hill Road is. It seems pretty dark right here. Maybe a little bit of pooling right here, actually, which I hadn't noticed before. Very dark spot. And then this is like water saturation for sure, but it doesn't seem to be a continuous drainage right here. And then it picks up again further down.
You may not have data on this, but can you take a wild guess at what it might have been like before white people started to farm it?
My guess would be a shrub wetland in most areas, kind of like what's in the Wilson wetland now, would be my guess. And
a lot of beaver activity.
Yeah, a lot of beavers. Yeah. Yeah.
Do the splotches on the road in the later picture imply trees or puddles or something?
Yeah, those right here.
Mm-hmm.
It could. I mean, shadows do cast, do show up in these images. And I think, for example, the dark areas sometimes that you see on some of these images on the eastern side by Sand Hill Pond, those are shadows from trees. And it's kind of a steep terrain out that way, too. I'm not sure that a single tree, you would really see the shadow from a single tree. So it's a little hard to say. I'm not sure. This bigger blotch right here, I think, might be something more significant. Yeah, good questions. All right, and so now we've got 2000 on the left-hand side and then 2010 on the right-hand side. So now I think we're really, like, the image quality is getting much better, but Sand Hill Road looks like a solid road. The drainage patterns on the western side of the valley, they're not as noticeable, and also the land use has totally changed, whereas this area was totally like hayed or farmed, or now it's going back to a shrubby wetland, which is closer to what we have now. And then the area to the north shows a lot of water saturation, sort of looks scattery and mottled, maybe pretty close to what we have now, sort of a marshy area. And then Sand Hill Pond is right here. And then one thing that's noticeable is that the bottom of Sackett's Brook here has sort of lost definition. Like, I'm not seeing the dark outlines of Sackett's Brook that you have up here. It sort of disappears halfway through the image. And then if you look really closely at this image, you can actually see that perhaps the hydrology is sort of shortcutting the bottom half of Sackett's Brook right here and sort of diving into the western part of the valley. All right, and then the last, penultimate one is 2010 on the right-hand side. Here's Sand Hill Pond. Now Sackett's Brook is really faint in this area where it was, very easily seen before. You just have this little stub after the bridge, and then it seems like the hydrology is going eastward now into Wilson Wetland. And then I'm going to quickly go over the last picture. 2019, close to present. I think we all know what it looks like now. So Sackett's Brook is really not following this course anymore. It's now coming under the bridge in Sand Hill Road, turning to the west, and then going into the shrub wetland, which we call the Wilson Wetland. So to recap, my main observations were a lot of agricultural land use until the 1970s. Looks like Sand Hill Road has gone through some improvement or modification over time. Maybe not as high of a road in the 50s or originally, and then was built up over time, placement of culverts, and started functioning more like a dam than a road that was set on native grade. And then big changes in the location of flow patterns, and then changes that seem to happen. I know that Tropical Storm Irene obviously was a big event that affected Sackett's Brook. But based on this review of the aerial imagery, it seems to me that changes were happening even before Tropical Storm Irene. And so basically that's the story here, that we have an aggregation of different factors kind of playing into what we have today. Okay, so now I think I need to speed things up a little bit. So here's a graph basically summarizing how much water. We have different methods of estimating how much water is traveling in Sackett's Brook. And there's different flow regimes. There's base flow, which is the flow that you have at most times. And then you have higher flows when you have storm events, rain events. And we have ways of estimating how much water you might expect to get in Sackett's Brook based on these different flow regimes. So on this graph, we're showing the amount of water in cubic feet per second on the left-hand side, and then cubic feet per second per square mile of drainage area on the right-hand side. And then these different lines kind of represent different methods we have of estimating how much water is flowing. And from left to right, you go from a small flood event, so a return interval. A flood return of 1 year would be the storm that you would expect to have on average every year. And then a 10-year storm would be every 10 years you get one on average. Every 100 years, the 100-year storm that a lot of people are familiar with. And so as you go from left to right, you go from a small flood event to a higher flood event, and so the predicted flows kind of ramp up. And vice versa, the probability that any of these flood levels is going to happen does the opposite as the return interval. So a 100-year storm is pretty rare. It's got a 1% annual exceedance probability, and that probability goes up as the flood return decreases. So we have different methods, and based on our experience, we kind of have to average these different methods, or if we have reason to believe that one is better than another, we'll go, if we have a project that calls for a more conservative estimate, then we might go with the top model, the one that predicts the highest flows, just to make sure that we're conservative. If we're working on a restoration, we might look at this and take an average of these different measurements and look at measurements that we've taken in the field and sort of reconcile the two pieces of information to come up with something that we think is reasonable. But these flows are pretty significant. You've got thousands of cubic feet per second going through Sackett's Brook in a medium to large flood. Okay, and I guess this is the lead up to the modeling that we did. So we take these flows for different flood events from rare, the 100-year flood level to more common 1 or 2 year flood return. And then we use these flows as inputs to a hydraulic model, which is the image on the left-hand side. And that model has a lot of parameters. There's land use, there's topography, there's data that I'm entering about the culvert sizes, the elevation of the road, and then the flows. So the flows are boundary conditions, basically. I'm telling the model, okay, all the water for the 1 year return interval is coming up at the head of the study area, and I'm telling the model, tell me where the water is going and how fast it's traveling. And the model tells me the water surface elevation in different areas and what the velocities are. And for the purpose of this study, we couldn't spend I couldn't do this for the 11 alternatives to a very high level of detail. So the model is good, but there's always refinements that can be done. But I think the model was really informative in terms of telling us, what kind of flood is going to overtop Sand Hill Road. How much water can we expect the culverts to carry? How much water is going to go under the bridge? And what kind of velocities do we have in different areas? Those measurements, I think, are pretty well captured by the model that we have right now. So in this image, I'm showing, I kind of forget what I'm showing actually. It might be a 10-year storm. And the reason I think it's a 10-year storm is because the 25-year storm is the storm level that just barely crests over Sand Hill Road. That's the storm where the culverts are just discharging as much water as they can, and they can't take any more, and the channel under the bridge has taken as much as it can as well, and the water is just backing up on the north side of Sand Hill Road, and it's starting to crest over the road. And in this image, I'm not seeing a lot of water going over the Sand Hill Road. So I think this is a 10-year storm. And then the color is an indication of how fast the water is traveling. And the legend ranges from 0 at the bottom to something like 15 feet per second. And you can see, water is coming through at, a lot of it is coming within the channel of Sackett's Brook, but it's definitely going over bank and reaching the far reaches of the valley and accessing the floodplain in many areas. And then that water is sort of butting up against the north side of Sand Hill Road. And then a little bit kind of goes across in the 4 culverts on the west side of the valley. A lot of water is also going under the bridge. And then there's another culvert here on the east side that's letting some water out. And you've got really high velocities right as the water is getting funneled under the Sand Hill Road Bridge, and then it sort of comes out on the south side. And then it enters the Wilson wetland, the shrubby area, that part of the wetland, and then the water has a lot of room to fan out. And the more room it has, the more it sort of slows down, and it's encountering a lot of shrubby vegetation, and it slows and it travels much slower. And then on the right hand side, I'm showing a cross-sectional view. So there's a faint pink line right here over Sand Hill Road. And so I've taken a slice through the model, and this is what the right hand side view is showing. So this is the west side. This is the road, Sand Hill Road. You come up to the Sackett's Brook channel. There's a bridge here that's not shown. Here's the channel. And then here's the other side of the road. And then you go up at this end of the image. And then these little lines are showing your water surface elevation for these different storms. So we've got a 2-year storm right here at the bottom, 10, 25, and then 100 is the last blue line, 100-year storm. So the 25 is the pink. That's when the water just barely creeps over the road.
And Irene was considered a 100-year storm?
It probably depends what parts of Vermont. I don't know
There's
about
no
this part of
active
Vermont.
There's no active flow gauge on the Sackett's Brook, but a lot of gauges in southern Vermont and Irene suggested 50, 100-year flood, 50-year flood or 100-year flood, in some cases exceeding 100-year flood. Just for reference, the floods that happened this past July in northern Vermont were 500-year floods, in central Vermont, 50 to 100-year floods.
I think we've had a few of those. I don't know if they're 50-year storms or 100-year storms in the last couple of years. I'm just curious, does anybody recall the water going over Sand Hill Road in the last 25 years? Over the top of it?
Yeah, for years.
Yes.
Yeah, several times.
And Irene.
In
There's
Irene,
3
yeah.
times. Once was in 2011, when Irene, and that pretty much wiped out the west end. The second time was 2017, and it took off part of the south side of the road on the west end. And the last time was 2021 in July, when we had that really big storm that wiped out everything all over Putney. It wiped out half of the road near the, right where he has, Rodrigue has it.
Yeah.
It didn't wipe the whole road off, just the bottom half. So there was conveyance that, I mean, the road could be used, but of course we closed it because it was too dangerous to drive.
Did it actually wipe it out, or it just went over it?
I'm sorry, was that?
Did it actually wipe it out, or did it just go over it?
It went over it and wiped off the south section, the south part of it. So a large portion came off the south, the part of the road that's towards town. The one that's towards the central school pretty much stayed there.
So we've had 3 25-year storms in the last 12 years.
I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me that pretty soon they're going to have to modify what they call a 25-year storm.
Yeah, there's already guidance that we're using on how to put a conservative buffer on the flow estimates, which are changing, our hydrology is changing. Yes, how about, we'll do one more question, and then we'll try to keep the questions if we could, perhaps till the end, so we get through it. Yes.
Regarding the July 2021 storm, I stood in where the road had been washed out on the southerly side to the west of the box culvert. It was about waist high, so it was washed out about 3 feet deep from about halfway across the road. But that means there was a whole lot of road left under my feet.
And all of this information is super useful when we're developing these models. Because we can, if we know the surface elevation was a certain height above a point that we can track today, then we can tweak the model to kind of replicate what the known elevation of these storms was. So having all of this information from people that have observed floods and how far the flood extent has occurred is something that we really benefit from in terms of calibrating these models. So just some pictures that we took in our visits to the Sackett's Brook area. This is sort of a typical image of Sackett's Brook near the Putney Central School. Sort of a well-defined channel, slightly incised. Modest levels of erosion. Then here's the Portal Bridge, part of the Force for Learning trail, with quite a bit of sedimentation occurring, also some erosion on the eastern bank. And then as you travel south towards the roads, you go from a river, a pretty well-defined river system, to something that's more marshy on either side of the banks of Sackett's Brook, with the road sort of acting as a dam and a lot of ponded water on the north side of the road. Then you've got my former colleague here, Evelyn. You've got Sand Hill Road Bridge right here. And so this is what it looked like in 2022 with the dam just south of the bridge. And at the time, we did notice that the eastern side of the dam where it met the bank, it looked a little eroded and showing some signs of weakness. And obviously, recently, there was a large flow event that really took a chunk out of that bank, and all of that material kind of traveled a short distance downstream. And for a while, the dam was breached. It wasn't holding any more water, and water elevation was at equilibrium on both sides of what remained of the dam. And then if you go further south yet, you've got, this is like downhill from the baseball diamond. So a much more open habitat, like shrub wetlands. The channel is not like super well defined. It's kind of flat and shallow, and then it looks like the water could easily access all parts of the wetland. And then at the very southern end of the study area, you've got the dam right by the Bellows Falls Road and the general store. And then I've got a few pictures that we took more recently. So this is Sand Hill Road Bridge right here, and then that significant bank erosion that happened. I sort of forget what time of the year it was. I want to say it was in the fall of 2020.
It was late spring.
Oh.
It was in late spring.
Okay.
2023.
Okay. Okay. So that's what it looked like, and it's already, we were there earlier today, and it's already filling in with deposits, and the dam looks like it's now spanning the whole width of the brook, and it's holding back a very small amount of water. I would say the water surface elevation, it's really high flows right now, but it looked like the water surface elevation was about the same on either side, maybe a drop of a few inches as you went from upstream to downstream. And then a lot of the deposits basically were cast a fairly short distance downstream, I think, and that's what is shown right here. And so the west bank, which previously looked really high relative to the water surface elevation, if you look today, it's only 6 inches to a foot higher than where the water surface is.
Can I ask a question while we're on that slide? Is that the spot in that middle slide where you're thinking of lowering that bank to allow more water to flow into the west side of the lower section of the brook?
Yep. That's exactly where it is. As it's about to make that turn, or just starting to make that turn to the west towards.
And is that a former channel of the brook?
I think the former channel was further to the right on that image. Yeah. So it's not far, but I think it's a bit further south than where the former channel was. And then one thing that Evan and I noticed the last time we were here, not today, but the time before that, is that there seems to be some scour affecting the western footing of the Sand Hill Road Bridge.
Scour?
What does that mean?
There's what was the
So
word?
some erosion.
Undermining, where the velocity of the water is so high, and it's whisking the natural sediment in the bed out from around the footing of the bridge and even underneath it. So there's some of the abutment, actual bottom of the abutment is exposed. You can see in that photograph.
Yeah.
So we can talk a little bit about this when we get to the concept design.
Okay, and so So we also looked at wetland habitat functions and values, and we followed forms are commonly used with Vermont permitting for wetland impacts. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because I'm already going too long. But the point of it is that for all of the areas that we've looked at in the study area, we're seeing functions and values supported fairly well. I mean, some are low in some areas and higher in others, but I'd have to say that on average, we're seeing a lot of functions and values, and it's a question of quality. And it's somewhat subjective too. And these things change over time. Okay.
Okay, so I'm sure there's more questions. We can get back to them once we're done with our piece. So now we're going to get into the actual alternatives. So all of that information and analysis that Rodrigue just described really led us to think about these key objectives that I mentioned up front, and what kind of interventions would work towards reducing the vulnerability of the road, for example, improving the ecology of the wetland, improving that connectivity of Sackett's Brook to its floodplain in those areas where it's become disconnected. So again, just revisiting the objectives here. Some of you were able to get this map in your hand, and I still don't know why this is bothering me. We can't see. Haven't figured out how to get rid of that thing.
Look under the moor. Often there's a spot over there that lets you. Those 3 buttons on the right hand side.
Yeah, the thing is they don't show up on my.
Right, just won't let you look at it.
Yeah. Anyways, there are. I know we love technology until we hate it, right? So there are 11 alternatives shown on this map, and they really span quite a breadth of interventions, from the one that in the room we can't see, but on the Zoom you can see. There's improving vegetation and even suggested of starter beaver dams, so actually introducing wood into the channel to encourage beavers to basically colonize that wood and build upon it and create begin to create a beaver dam of their own. Improving floodplain vegetation, and then really a lot of the alternatives that we focused on were centered around Sand Hill Road. And I think it's probably obvious to many of you why. Sand Hill Road is an unnatural feature that's basically perpendicular to the valley, and there's a lot of there's been a lot of issues with flooding around and over it and through it over the years. And if you saw that image that Rodrigue had up of the hydraulic modeling, you saw that really a lot of high velocity water moves through the one opening in the road in small and moderate floods, and then through other smaller openings, the culverts that we're going to talk about in a minute, off to the west of the bridge in the biggest flood. Well, when that high velocity water moves through that one opening, obviously it has the potential to do a lot of work in the channel, to do a lot of erosion. So part of the reason you're seeing a lot of down cutting or incision in the bed downstream of the road is simply because all that water's got to squeeze through that one opening. And as Rodrigue mentioned, the channel has changed alignment and kind of rolled off to one side, and that's further led to incision, down cutting of the channel around and downstream of the road. So because of all those things, a lot of the interventions were that we proposed were focused around the road. And I'll get to those here. So here are the 11 alternatives in a table. And if any of you have used Consumer Reports, you know that you're familiar with the symbology. We use it often. Just, a hollow circle is not good. A half-filled circle is pretty good. A full-filled circle is very good. Or in this case, ineffective, moderately effective, and effective down here, the key at the bottom. This is really, it's a quantitative, but really kind of an illustrative way to show what we are thinking about for the different objectives that we had in mind. So without going into too much detail on these, on each alternative, I just want to make sure everybody understands what we're looking at. So when we say reduce flood risk, we're talking about an intervention that will actually lower the floodwater elevation. For example, if we put more conveyance capacity underneath Sand Hill Road, that's going to allow more water to flow through the road rather than over the top. It's going to lower the surface water elevation upstream of the road, right? Because more water can pass through. It's not building up head behind it. That's reducing flood risk.
Can I ask a question about that? Is that only looking at the flood risk to the road, or are there other places that
there are other places. So we're thinking, I'm just using that as an example. So reducing flood risk could be down in the village as well. Any intervention that could lower the surface water elevations and floods in the village we would have counted as effective under that criteria. Reduce erosion risk. I think that's pretty obvious to many of you. Slowing down the velocity of the water, where it generally, from a human-centered standpoint, where it interacts with things that we care about, infrastructure. That's reducing erosion risk. Of course, we care about how much erosion is happening in the channel too, because that has to do with the balance of the channel and the connectivity to its floodplain and the overall condition of the ecosystem. That notion I just mentioned now of floodplain connectivity and what we call equilibrium in the channel, we accept that river channels move over time. They move up and down. They move across the valley, but they're really kind of in a sweet spot, and they're maximizing their functions and values in the ecosystem when they're in what we call a state of equilibrium. In other words, the amount of sediment and water moving from upstream down through the system is balanced with the ability of the channel to move that through over time. So it's neither down cutting or moving up in elevation. Dynamic equilibrium. Of course, the Wilson wetland is a top concern, so that's what this column, restoring habitat and wetland functions. And then feasibility. So, these were sort of our broad ecology and river objectives over here on the left. And then, of course, we have how much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? And how hard would it be to get this project done? I think it's important for everybody to recognize whenever we do one of these studies, we really want to think about the whole breadth of extremes of intervention, from doing nothing, which is an alternative, and we don't actually have it listed up here, but we could say that nothing needs to be done, or nothing will be done. It won't cost anything to do, but we'll be left with a cost of maintenance of that condition over time, right? So there's always a cost of doing nothing, even if you're not doing a project. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we had to think about removing Sand Hill Road altogether out of the floodplain.
No!
And we had, we were charged with looking at every possible alternative for restoring this ecosystem, and that is an unnatural, massive fill, across the floodplain that has been problematic. So we wanted to give that its due course and due diligence as well. So through that list of alternatives, I'll just back up for a minute. where did my, there it is. These ballpark costs, that's, you know, what we know about the site and the project today. We know the site pretty well. We feel we can get within a reasonable range of costs, but you're not going to hold us to these costs as we move forward in the project, because of course things could change. But you know, so my point is in mentioning that and the implementation time frame is that we have a pretty good handle on the parameters of feasibility at this stage, enough to certainly bracket it. Is this going to be a 5-year project? Is it a 1-year project? And of course, these give you a sense of how the project would play out if it were picked. So, any questions on this? Because this stuff is important as we move into the examples. Yep.
Is there any way to get number 1, number 5, and number 7 isolated? Because that's really what we're talking about. It seems to me.
Well, I'm sorry. What do you, when you say isolated, those three together?
Well, number 1 is replace existing culverts with larger culverts.
Yeah.
Number 5 is remove, and it says a section of Sand Hill Road. And number 7 says flood bench or flood chute south of Sand Hill Road. Doesn't that correspond with alternative A on our green?
Oh, I'm sorry. I see what you're saying. Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Right.
So what is a flood bench?
What is a flood bench? Well, we're going to show you what a flood bench is in a minute. Yeah, Rodrigue, when the 3 alternatives were selected by the steering committee and the select board, Rodrigue took those and assigned letters to them. Just not to further confuse you, but what was the reason behind that?
Because I just felt like if I called them 1, 2, and 3, then there would be 2 sets of numbers, one for the alternatives and then one for the final concepts that were retained.
Yeah.
And so by sticking with numbers for one and letters for the other, that was kind of making a clean break.
And alternative B here is actually numbers 1 and 3.
Yeah, okay, I'm good. So it's the odd numbers. This is how I've remembered it. I'll give you a hint. So alternative A is 1 and 3 together. So we're looking at 1, 3, 5, and 7. Alternative A is 1.
B is 1 and 3.
I'm sorry. Alternative B is 1 and 3.
Right. Alternative A is 7.
Alternative A is 7. Thank you. And alternative C, remove Sand Hill Road, is 5.
Except a section of is, yeah.
Not the whole road.
Okay. Yes, there is a section that is.
Does this mean that we're not considering anything else? We can't ask a question about, so why didn't you choose, I don't know.
Oh, we can have a discussion about the others. Why don't we work through those 3 selected alternatives in more detail? Because that's where we spent the brunt of our time. But we know enough about the others, we can speak to them. Yeah?
You said that the matrix that you had up there is quantitative data. So the representations that are put up there, which are, they're because you only have 3 categories, they have to be, you basically have summarized your data. But each of those is based on something that you can quantify, that you can measure.
Correct. Yeah.
It's not an overall judgment.
Well, it's an interpretation of the quantitative results of the modeling that we did and our observations in the field, and actually looking at the data and using our best professional judgment to fit them into basically high, medium, low, or yeah.
Is proceeding with 2 or 3 moderately effective and cheaper options an option instead of just one more expensive?
Well, I think all 11 alternatives are something the town could pursue, or any of the 11 in any combination, really. I think what Mary was saying at the beginning about the grant is it requires the town to pick a minimum of one, I think, as part of this process. And recommend that it move forward, I think, in some fashion at some point.
This gentleman had a question.
Oh, yeah.
Since you had said it was quantitative, I was looking up under feasibility, ease of implementation, and wondering how that was measured. But I just saw the footnote. Part of it is adding up the number of stakeholders, but part of it is political feasibility. That sounds a little bit less quantitative. I was wondering how.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I guess when this gentleman was asking me, how did we fill in these little consumer reports symbols here, I was thinking, these are really the quantitative, the 4 columns to the left here. I would say, I was thinking about how did we interpret our scientific observations of the site and fit them into these categories.
One's attention is drawn to alternative 5 as being conspicuously the most effective, according to your analysis, but then it's also labeled the most difficult. And I was imagining that perhaps it's the politically most difficult.
And expensive.
Extreme.
Yeah.
Extreme.
Yeah, so.
Can I just point out one thing also? The half circles that I'd asked in a question it's not necessarily 50%. It could be 25%, it could be 75%. So we actually don't know exactly, but we just know it's not 100 or 0.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's an assessment of, think of it as low, medium, and high effectiveness, or whatever you're trying to measure, based on the information that we know and the calculations and the modeling that we did to fit them in there. Science is precise, but at the end of the day, we have to make a professional judgment based on all the information we have, and this is our best professional judgment. I guess is how I'd answer that. Yes?
So the 3 alternatives, A, B, and C, were recommended or picked out by the select board, is that correct?
The select board and the wetland committee.
Recommended them to the select board, and the select board voted on them to be pursued for further study. Again, there's no saying, there wasn't a desire to say which was on our part the one we would select. It's just to say, okay, let's just take these 3 and have a study on them, okay? And the select board agreed with that in November.
Okay.
And the select board will make the final decision about which one you go forward with?
Yeah.
And I think you're all here to take this in and provide input that the town will consider. I think they emphasized that at the beginning. So, all right. So I'm sure there are going to be quite a few more questions, and we'd love to take them on really any of the 11 alternatives or anything we've talked about tonight, and especially these 3 picked alternatives. I want to just take a minute. We're a little bit over the time that we had. So, and these are conceptual engineering drawings that I have up, and they're pretty small on this screen, right? So I'm just going to kind of give a high level, point out where things are with these 3 alternatives, and then summarize some costs and some other considerations of feasibility. The report, though, if you wanted to actually print out and study these in more detail, you're going to see them quite a bit better, piece of paper in your hand than on the screen. Again, just to be clear, we're going to walk through alternative A, which is the bench cut south of Sand Hill Road, alternative B, which are additional culverts on Sand Hill Road, and then C, which is the removal of most of the road, leaving a portion of it, and removal of the bridge.
Point of clarification. When you say bench cut, what are you meaning?
Yep, I'm going to explain that right now. We're going to walk through these, okay? This is Sand Hill Road right here. The blue hatching here, shading, is the extent of our estimation of the extent of floodwaters in a 25-year storm. Okay, so you might have noticed, or you will notice if you study the report in detail, a 25-year storm, remember Rodrigue said, is just breaching the road and causing a lot of erosion in those events over the top of the road. And we're seeing that here, the blue over the top of the road. So this alternative of cutting a bench just south of the bridge opening on basically where the river goes over that beaver dam and then turns left. It used to turn right for many years, and when I say right, river right, turn to the west and flow out in this area. Now it flows this way. And it turns out the grade of this area of the wetland is lower generally. The landscape grade over here is lower than it is over here. So Sackett's Brook used to kind of sit higher in the valley. The bed of the brook sat higher in the valley when it flowed to the west. Now that it's rolled off to the east, that has caused it to cut down in the landscape back toward the bridge because the grade downstream of that new path is lower. Well, when the river is headed toward a lower grade, over time the bed is going to equilibrate or back up, and that scour or that erosion that we're seeing around the abutments of the bridge, we think is related to the fact that the channel has realigned itself, which is a natural event, but now it's set at a lower elevation, and that lower elevation is moving back, traveling back up through the bridge over time. Okay, so that's an important consideration for the durability and the longevity of that bridge with this realignment. So what we're doing with this bench cut, when we say bench cut, we're distinguishing from a practice that we often design in other river projects that's a bigger scale. We call it a floodplain cut. So it's really just terminology that we use to distinguish how big of an area are we excavating to a lower elevation to allow floodwaters to spill out into that area. A floodplain cut might be on the order of acres. A bench cut, tens of thousands of square feet, less than a full acre. I don't remember what the area is here.
What you're showing right now is existing conditions. So the next slide is alternative A.
So here is the cut here. And this is basically a bit of a high ground between these two low points. You can see the blue indicating where inundation would be in a 25-year flood. There's sort of this kind of ridge in between those two low points. And what this objective is, or what this alternative is getting at, is basically trying to spread the floodwaters out more evenly at the downstream end and provide some relief. Because when floodwaters get out of the channel and spread out more, they don't have as much, they're not confined in a V-shaped channel, they're not digging that bed down further. So this bit of work and excavation would help alleviate some of that aggravated erosion that's happening in the bed just downstream of the bridge that's, again, traveling back up and affecting the bridge.
Would that only be effective during bad storms? The channel wouldn't be moving the channel normally.
That's correct. In a normal base flow, it wouldn't be out over that bank, but I think it was designed to flow over in like a 1 or a 2 year flood. So most decent sized floods would spill out over that area and relieve the energy in the river channel itself.
So you're saying the bench cut is in the middle piece of land.
It is.
I
Yep.
thought
It's,
before you'd had it over on the other side. Okay.
yeah, it was a slightly different drawing that just, well, this is the existing condition. So on all these, and just for convention here, the existing conditions plan has an aerial photo on it just to kind of give you some orientation. So that's what, when you look at these and when you print them out, hopefully if you do, you'll notice there's an aerial photo on one, and the proposed condition is more of a traditional engineering drawing, just grayscale, black and white. So. And there are some profiles. I don't want to spend too much time in here, but these profiles kind of show you different views of both the cross-section of the channel or the profile of the channel from upstream to down, and how this excavation relates to that and the flows. Okay, alternative B, right? The addition of culverts. Here's the bridge, and there are existing culverts to the west, but they're all quite small, and they're not sufficient to convey the biggest floods, which is why we have the stories of many floods rolling over. Imagine a waterfall, over the road. Well, when it rolls over the road, and it's higher elevation behind the road to the north and a lower elevation to the south, it's got a gradient, and it's going to dig the gravel out. And that's why we see, if you walk into the woods south of the road, lots of road gravel, many iterations of the road being washed into the wetland. So adding conveyance capacity in the road obviously is going to allow more to go underneath the road and prevent that condition of overtopping and erosion and repair. That's a costly repair for the town. It also is doing another thing. Instead of requiring essentially most of the flow to be pushed through the bridge opening, it's distributing that flow better over the floodplain. So again, that condition where the channel has got a lot of energy and digging around those abutments, combined with the fact that it's at a lower elevation because it just slid off to the east, adding culverts would alleviate in the small and moderate floods that erosion potential at the bridge opening itself, which would lead to hopefully a more durable bridge over time. And just by distributing water more evenly across the floodplain, we're essentially restoring the hydrology of the floodplain across a much wider area, both to the east and the west. So there's multiple flood resiliency benefits and ecological benefits of this alternative. And these views, I know they're small on the screen, but just show you what the culverts, and in particular the larger, what we call squash culvert, would look like beneath the road. So we picked one particular location where we see, historically a lot of hydrology, and that's where we stuck the largest culvert. It has to be, to get the greatest area of flow, through this pipe, we picked what's called a squash pipe, so it's wider than it is tall, because there has to be a certain amount of road basically over the top of the pipe, a cover it's called, so the pipe doesn't get damaged when plowing is happening and all that kind of thing, and the weight of vehicles traveling over the pipe. So that's what you see in this image, a squash pipe. And finally, the alternative to remove most of Sand Hill Road, but for a portion along the eastern side here, which is due south of the pond. And this would be essentially, obviously this is an extreme alternative. We acknowledge that. And this would be full restoration of the Sackett's Brook floodplain and wetland ecosystem over time. It would remove the main impediment and the the problems that we're talking about, both related to the road and related to water being shunted through, few openings in a road that goes parallel to the flow in a wide valley. Obviously, we acknowledge our charge here as water resource professionals was to evaluate this because it was picked. It would certainly result in the greatest restoration and the least amount of vulnerability to the town's infrastructure right here. But obviously it comes with a big cost. This is a town road. It is used. We've spent enough time out there to know that it is traveled frequently. There's been concerns raised, legitimate concerns raised by folks in the community about the use of this road as a detour when other roads are major roads in town, state highways are down, or there's other interruptions or emergencies. All these things that we looked at and focused on, we're not traffic engineers, so we didn't evaluate that. It's out of our area of expertise. And not to say we had our blinders on for, the river and the floodplain, but that is what we were charged to do. So we acknowledge that more evaluation, more conversation would have to happen around the other side of this, the actual utility and use of the road. So.
I just asked, you had add a bridge. Was that a bridge on that existing road, or was that creating a different road west of the Sands? And one of your ideas that you didn't pursue.
Oh, yeah. So that's just almost like a similar alternative to adding culverts, just adding a bigger opening through the road, which would be quite expensive. Bridges are substantially more expensive than culverts beneath the road because you have to engineer the footings and all that.
So it's not.
So that one kind of fell to the wayside. It was an idea.
Like a whole nother Sand Hill Road somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay. So just to recap here are the three alternatives, and this is a bit of a summary of the estimated cost of implementation, the estimated time for implementation, and this column would include, for example, if the town tomorrow said, we want you to work on, or someone to work on alternative A. This 2 to 3 years would be design, permitting, and construction. Not just, certainly wouldn't take 2 to 3 years to cut a bench. We're talking about the life of the project from start to finish, design to completion. All of these alternatives have permitting considerations. We're surrounded by a floodplain and a wetland and a stream, and potentially archaeologically sensitive areas tend to be focused or situated around water courses, because that's what Native Americans, where their encampments were, and just like us, the resources were used by them as well. And then over here on the right-hand column, this is in the report, potential funding sources in Vermont. There's quite a few for each of these, and we think good funding sources, including the same funding source that funded this study does support implementation projects as well, especially run through this program. So, you can hold that for 1 second. This is the last slide. So just some final thoughts, and these are in the conclusions of the report as well. I touched on this with the road removal alternative. The criticality of the road, the importance of the road to the town really would obviously need to be studied and understood if that alternative were to be considered going forward. In particular, its use during times of emergency and detours. Number 2, quantifying Sand Hill Road repair and maintenance costs. So the do-nothing alternative comes with a cost is kind of the point of this. if none of these alternatives are moved forward, I'm sure the town has records of its maintenance and repair. And are those staying the same? If you look at the decades of costs accounting for inflation, or are they increasing? Is that reason to consider some of these alternatives to mitigate the damage that's happening on the road and floods, which we all know are becoming more frequent and bigger? The value of the wetland to the wetland committee is very clear. I think it's clear with many of you showing up to the importance of these issues. So just understanding, again, where these issues fit into the broader town, either through polling, might help guide the town in one direction or another with these alternatives that span such a breadth of objectives. And then we mentioned that we have reason to believe the bridge is in a tricky spot right now with the way the channel's moved and seeing that's undermining of the footing. We really think that ought to be monitored closely, given what we're seeing with the scour. So,
Can I just make a statement about the number 4, which you wouldn't have known, but that scouring mainly happened in the storm in July 2021. Okay. A lot of material was taken out from under there. And there were so many things going on around town where roads were totally closed that that wasn't included. I did think just by oversight in terms of looking at something that needed remediation efforts.
Uh-huh.
So it's been pretty much the same since then, but the scour is obviously still obvious, right?
Yeah.
So, but that people around here know that parts of roads just fell into the, like one fell 30 feet down. So this was kind of minor compared to some of the other things, but it is something I appreciate you bringing that up, because it is something that the town should keep an eye on, and maybe have somebody come out and look at it. So.
All right, well we've gone a bit over. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We won't be offended if some of you want to run along. We will stay here and answer as many questions as you'd like. Rodrigue, I don't know if you want to come up here and we can kind of tag team on questions. You had a question, I want to honor you.
Yeah, you have the project timeline of 2 to 3 years or whatever for each option, and the cost there, I'm assuming that is the cost of just not yearly maintenance beyond that. I'm particularly interested in like yearly maintenance of the bench culvert and things like that, or especially with all the beaver activity.
Sure. Yep. Yes, that is like the capital costs, not excluding, life cycle or maintenance costs. And I think, is that just the construction costs? Or in the report, we baked in design and engineering fees too, but I can't recall. Actually, I think this table, and we can update it for the final report if need be, but we added, kind of soup to nuts costs for the 3 selected alternatives in the report, whereas this table just is a ballpark construction implementation cost. If that makes sense. You are next.
Yeah, I've got 2 questions. First, given the anecdata that you've heard here tonight, and given that we know that precipitation in the area is going to keep increasing, would it be fair to say that the 25-year standard that you're basing this on is probably more like a 5-year standard?
That's a big jump, and you're not wrong at all that, see, in hydrology, we only have information up to a certain point in time, right? And to extrapolate forward how things are changing, you have to do, some pretty simple statistics actually, which we and many others have done with data in Vermont. But there is an inflection point if you look at decades of flow data in the 1970s or 80s, there's an inflection point. You know, if you were to plot the data, you'd see a change. And there's reason to believe there's another inflection point, you know, say 10, 15 years ago, with the many large floods that we've seen in the past decade. So a general rule of thumb that's being used in our profession for how much additional flow should we account for conservatively, if we take the 25-year flood, we're going to put 20 to 25% on that flow as a conservative value.
And I'm guessing that you already did that in what you
We
shared.
did, yeah. Well, what we did was accounted for various methods to estimate flow, because Sackett's Brook doesn't have a gauge doesn't have a U.S. Geological Service gauge. So Rodrigue mentioned we sort of averaged different flow methods that sort of bumped up our flow estimates. So we feel like we're being, you know, somewhat conservative.
Yeah. Yeah, what I would add is that we're not considering the 25-year flood event as a standard. It's just a flood level that I picked that I thought was informative in terms of showing what benefits you could get between existing condition and the different alternatives. And I could have shown these images for any of the floods that we considered, from a 2-year flood event to a 100-year flood event. So I'm not in any way attached to the 25-year flood. I just think it's a very relevant one in terms of determining what the benefits of these different alternatives are.
Okay.
It does happen to be the design flood for municipal structures, historic, conventionally. People are thinking about that a little bit differently today, but.
There's a question back here.
Oh, yeah.
Somewhat of a related question,
Yeah.
I think. I'm thinking about how I would even begin to select one of these options. I don't, even after all of your information, thank you for that. It's hard for me to assess. So my question, I guess, would be, when relating that question to the options, the way they're listed, A, B, and C, is that in terms of the resilience to the unknown? Say, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Can you rate those three? How would you rate those three in terms of resiliency for the unknown?
There you go. Look into your crystal
I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, you know.
Well, yeah.
If we I'll take a stab at that, and then you feel free to follow. I mean, if we define resiliency as, you know, resiliency is a buzzword today. It's being used in a lot of our work. I think of it as, you know, how are we decreasing our risk to infrastructure, or fortifying it such that it's going to stand the test of time in the face of the change we're seeing, right? So removing the road is a bit of an oddball in that way, right? It could be perceived as the most resilient because you're taking the asset out of harm's way. But
Sort of. Or really harming it.
but it comes with a cost, right, of not being used any longer. But I'd say, you know, certainly putting the culverts in is going to be more effective and more result in greater resiliency than the bench cut. And I think that's clear. Oh geez, some of you are, why don't we go with you?
This may seem like a really basic question, but looking at, you know, the least popular, most extreme example here, removing a section of the road. I did go on the walk, just, you know, that they had a couple of weeks ago, so I saw how extensive an area we're talking about. I'm just wondering, how does that happen? What happens to all the
fill?
The fill that's taken out? That seems like an awful lot
And
of
does
material.
the value of that fill recoup some of the cost? Because
What
gravel's
happens to
valuable,
that?
right?
You know, what's the process of doing?
Yeah.
What's the process of making that happen?
Yeah, well, in some ways, almost in our minds, it's besides the getting to the point of removing it, you know, having the will to remove it or the interest in removing it.
That aside.
You know, removing the road itself is quite simple. It's just dismantling. It's getting the fill out of the floodplain, and then matching the elevation from
How
up.
much are you talking about, though? How many, I don't know how you can measure it.
I think it was shown on that alternative. I mean, it's thousands of yards of.
I've got a rough estimate.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, just based on your graphic presentations.
Sure.
Figuring a 10-yard dump truck, it would be a little bit over 100 dump truck loads.
I think it's more than that, but we have the yardage. We have an estimate of the yardage.
It's a crude estimate.
Yeah. But it's moving that material somewhere. We don't know if it's all gravel. Probably, if you looked at some of the historical images that Rodrigue put up, probably it was at a much lower grade when it was first. It was probably just barely above the wetland, and whoops, that was insufficient. Let's add some more fill. It probably got built up over time, is my guess. And what the quality of that material is we could find out by doing some test pits if that were of interest. But it'd be moving that material out of the floodplain somewhere where it can be utilized somewhere else.
The town hall on.
Yep.
I can address what the two previous speakers have raised. I've studied the consultant's report, and the rankings of alternatives prioritize removing the Sand Hill Road Causeway. Consultants have not considered where around 9,000 cubic yards, hundreds of dump truck loads of earth from removing the Sand Hill Road Causeway, will be deposited temporarily and permanently, and what land use planning, permitting, and cost to Putney taxpayers will be required. Consultants also have not considered that the Sand Hill Road Causeway is emergency vehicles' only direct route to Putney east of Bear Hill, where Route 5 between Kimball Hill and Sand Hill Road is impassable for any reason. Consultants therefore have not considered feasibility and cost to Putney taxpayers of creating a replacement direct route for emergency vehicles via Mill Street, a new bridge over Sackett's Brook, and High-Low Biddy Road. Removing the Sand Hill Road Causeway is a non-starter. Thank you.
Appreciate that comment, and we do acknowledge that we have not evaluated, and that I'll say it again. We recognize that our charge was specific to the objectives, and that needs to be studied much further if it's going to be considered. So, yes.
I wanted to talk about the culverts and replacing the culverts and project what the disruption would be to the road. There are 4 culverts to the west of and 1 to the east. And where have you related to that? Which culvert would become the arch, the pipe arch, or whatever you call it?
It was culvert number 4.
Is that closest to the bridge, or?
It's the second one from the west end of Sand Hill Road.
Okay, so it's pretty far to the west.
Yeah.
I've got my cursor on it right now.
That's the one that has the most water flowing through it now.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, my question is really about, that work would be contracted by the town to another entity. You're out of the picture then. And here it says that it would take 2 to 3 years to do that. Yeah, 2 to 3 years, and only $50,000 to $75,000. But the road would not be usable when the culverts are being dug out and replaced with the bigger culverts. So we are going to lose the use of the road for 2 to 3 years.
No. Oh gosh, no, maybe 2 weeks. This is not. Yeah.
The rest of it's all planning and permitting.
Yeah, that's a conservative estimate of time.
It would take a year to plan and research.
Permit it. Well, 2 to 3 years is probably quite conservative.
Yeah.
We'd rather be conservative than say it could happen in 6 to 12 months. To get the funding. We're considering the cycles that we often see in projects: design, permitting, okay, now you have a design in hand, now you need to do some fundraising. There are various sources of funds to do these projects, and the comment about the cost of Putney taxpayers, there are any of these really, if you could prove that the benefits outweigh the costs, and by tallying the flood reduction benefit and the loss of travel that occurs when the road is out from flooding and erosion, which is a cost to the town. All those things tallied up and weighed against the actual physical costs of doing the work. If you have what's called a positive benefit to cost ratio, there's a lot of funders out there, including FEMA, who would fund that work. There's always match for the town. There's usually, a 25% minimum match with a lot of grant sources. But given all the interest in flood resiliency right now, there's quite a bit of money out there to do this kind of work. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, could you go back to the slide that has just the 3 options? Because there you've added, I meant the one that has the money and the time.
Oh, okay, yep.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yeah. Just because you combine 2 that are from this sheet onto 1, right?
Right.
But it doesn't look like,
Oh,
maybe not really, in terms of the money.
so part of this is going from one phase of the work to the next, and we're refining our cost estimates here. So Rodrigo and I were just going back to the report today to revisit this. These numbers that you see here in this table and at the very tail end of the report are a reflection of our additional work to evaluate the costs of these alternatives. In the case where 2 have been smushed together, it's...
Okay, because it didn't.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying. Yep, it doesn't add up per se. Yep. Yes.
This may be a question for Mary, if she's, well, anyway, but somebody else may know. It seems to me that probably most people would not vote for decommissioning the road because, if we already had another road, if we had 2 roads instead of 1 as an alternative, then we'd maybe go for that. But because it's so expensive and it's our only detour, probably aren't going to go for that. But there are lots of other options on there, some of which are quite cheap. So it seems to me that we could do A and B and 5 other things there that are cheaper but still have some effect. I would not choose just A or B. I would choose 5 different things probably.
It's a great point. Yeah, there's a lot. This plan really is intended to be kind of a roadmap for the future for all these objectives. I mean, we often, as part of these projects, focus in on a few projects, but there's a nice long list of good projects. So I agree. Yes.
But they should be combined because we're not going to do them. We only do 1 of these. We're not going to do the 5 others in 5 years. If we do them all, if we decide to do them all now, they'll get done.
Well, yeah, that's if you guys are motivated and can seek the funding, all the power to you. Yeah. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. In speaking of resiliency, obviously, if you were to take the road out, it would no longer be an issue. But I'm wondering what the effect would be on the village, because I'm not a hydrologist, but it seems like the road acts like a weir, a partial dam, slowing water flow towards the village. So have you do you have any estimates on what effect, if any, not having that break on water going towards the village would be? And the other question is more historical. The culverts, as they are now, were pretty much replaced after Irene. And at that time, they couldn't expand them because of the FEMA criteria, but they were perched. They were intentionally raised, and what What advantage does that have, if any? Because you're talking about lowering them. It seems like a common sense thing to, make them bigger, lower them down, move more water flow to the west side of the floodplain, which is consistent with most of its history, I think, certainly within my memory, and reduce flow to the river. But is there any advantage to having those up the way they are now?
Yeah, I'll answer that one first, and then we can loop back to your flood reduction in the village question, which is an important one that we have thought about a lot. I don't know why, I don't know any reason why installing them sitting like that has any benefit, unless you're trying to concentrate like a low flow condition into the channel itself, into the main channel. But that's not something that we would have done. So yeah, putting them lower and making them bigger, lower to a point, right? If you bury them below grade, now you're losing capacity of the culvert to actually convey water. So lowering down to the sort of the base grade of the adjacent floodplain. Regarding your question about, is Sand Hill Road a dam that provides flood reduction benefit to the village? It's a really good question. Yes, it does what we say attenuate flow, right? So flow comes in and flow goes out. It's not a flood control dam. It wasn't designed as such, and it doesn't have the volume to flow ratio anywhere near what a flood control dam does. So it's really it's a very minimal, almost we think insignificant amount of attenuation to have an effect on the village. By improving the way water moves across that road, either with more culverts or naturalizing the floodplain altogether by decommissioning the road, the river we would expect over time to go from an incised state downstream of the road to a better balanced state with a lot more floodplain access in those flows, in those small and moderate flows downstream. So we think about it almost like a net or, a wash. Like if you lose that small flood attenuation upstream of the road, if you either put more holes in the road to pass the water faster, or you take the road out altogether, we think you'd get an equal, benefit downstream through floodplain connectivity and the attenuation that you'd expect in a natural floodplain system downstream. I don't know if that you follow that, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very clear answer. Just
yep.
One quick follow-up: is there any chance for what you're describing of it restoring the floodplain and improving access to it that would actually improve resiliency for the village?
I think many things will have a cumulative benefit on that over time, including revegetation, natural vegetation of the floodplain, right? So when there's a lot of vegetation, woody vegetation especially, which would be the natural state in that area, that provides a lot of what we call in hydrology roughness or friction for the water, right? So water moving over the field that you see from the bridge, that sort of hump, that basically those grasses mat down when water goes over it. That's a very smooth surface, right, for water to go over. If you add a lot of stems, woody stems in there, now that's a completely different story of the water flowing over that floodplain. So vegetation alone can have a huge effect. So the combination of vegetation and improving hydrology to try to get, the base elevation of the channel closer to the floodplain over time. Allow beavers in there without managing them, because they're going to have a benefit in attenuating sediment and water in the channel. All those things can work towards kind of returning to the natural state.
Thank you.
Yep.
We've talked a lot about damage to the road and flood risk to the road itself. Have you identified what properties or farms or other things are at risk of flooding in the surrounding area?
Yeah. You want to talk about the modeling, your modeling, all the way through the village and what you saw with?
Yeah. I don't remember seeing buildings or farms or infrastructure north of Sand Hill Road within the study area being at risk. But we did extend the model all the way to the dam and the village area. And unfortunately, I don't have any images of that. So I'm sort of have to go on what I remember of these images. I mean, I'd be very happy to email them to you or anyone else who's interested. I think I did see in the village area in really large storms, some of the properties, around the general store, mostly on the west side of Sackett's Brook, the edges of the building being sort of vulnerable to high flows.
Well, the
I don't
fire
think
station they were saying it was falling into the brook at one point, so that's probably vulnerable.
Yes, it's a little damp in there.
Yeah.
The storage spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think Route 5 itself was ever underwater in any of the model runs I ran. So I think it was properties north of the dam itself. And I think some water might have started to seep around the whole area and worked its way through the paper mill building, but not really over the road itself. There were lower elevation points on either side where the water tended to go, is what I remember. Now, I did a very quick model run of the study area for, I think it was a 100-year flood event with and without Sand Hill Road, and took a very quick look at what was going on down in the village. And what I remember is that the peak water surface elevation down in the village was down a few inches if you took out Sand Hill Road. And I think perhaps there part of the story is that when the village does flood, in most cases, we're talking about a pretty large flood event. And as we showed, in a 25-year flood event, Sand Hill Road is already underwater. So by the time you've got that much water, the road is sort of a dam, but it's already submerged. So it's not really retaining as much water anymore. It's not effectively storing a whole lot of water. And so it's there, it's probably slowing things down some, but basically it's underwater and the water's just rushing past it, cresting over it, and then reaching the village. And so if we take down the road, and you could play with the model some more, changing roughness coefficient and so on, but it looks like just expanding the flood plain areas, the areas that the water is able to reach, and spreading out the flow is going to lower the peak water surface elevation at least a little bit. Yeah.
Rodney, when you did that 25-year storm, did you take into consideration what culverts are there now, as opposed to what would be put in there?
Yeah, so the existing model has the 5 culverts at 24 inches diameter each. And then we had the elevations of the inverts, water going in and leaving the culvert. And the elevation of the road is in the model as well. So those are key.
Did you look at the difference of what it would be if it stayed the same in a 25-year storm, or if there was more water conveyance under the road under a 25-year storm?
With the more culverts, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Did you look at those two? Did you compare those?
Not tonight.
I'm not sure I followed the question.
I think we did, but not thinking about the village specifically, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. The data is there. I'm not.
Well, I guess I'm saying in terms of how much water goes over the road,
Oh.
if there's more conveyance under the road, was that?
Oh, what
I'm
flood
talking
level,
along the road,
what flood events is required before the water gets
would
over
it
the
be
road?
It would have to be a larger flood event if there were larger culverts?
Yes, it would be.
Yeah.
So the 25-year flood event under existing condition barely tops over the road. If you put in the larger culverts and the squash culvert, that flood event does not overtop the road anymore, but we're talking a few inches below. So it's sort of like, it becomes a matter of what do you call a 25-year flood event, or is it a 30-year flood event? So there is a clear benefits, under the, keeping everything else the same. You put in bigger culverts, you put in a squash culvert, there's no question the frequency at which the road is going to flood.
Yeah, my question was only, when you were saying it topping over, what were you using? You were using the conditions as they are now.
Yes.
Okay, that's really what my question was.
Yeah.
Symbol. Have you folks worked with any other towns or know of any other towns that have undertaken complete wetland restoration as a flood mitigation strategy in the town?
There are many towns that are considering this right now, several of which we're working with. And yes, if we sort of count floodplain restoration, as just kind of generalize and say wetland restoration or floodplain restoration, there are towns, and even, believe it or not, VTrans, who's one of our clients, has undertaken projects of reconnecting floodplains and showing that positive benefit to cost ratio and getting the project funded that way.
Any in particular you would recommend?
Oh, in terms of talking to a town.
What other people are doing?
Yeah. So the town of Waterbury has studied this a lot, as has Montpelier, as you might imagine.
Slightly bigger waterways.
Brattleboro has, on the
That's right.
Whetstone, it has a rather large
Thank you.
area.
Brattleboro has some very large projects in process right
Getting
now.
rid of some factories.
I'll put in a plug. I'm with Vermont River Conservancy and would be happy to answer questions later about one of those projects on the Whetstone.
Perfect.
We're doing a very large scale floodplain restoration that's modeled to have some pretty huge impacts and reductions on what's downtown.
Yep. Excellent. Yeah.
I have another two questions. First is, when we talk about removing the road, it strikes me as saying we've got to demolish this road before nature demolishes the road. So, while there's a price tag of $500,000, there's a way to do it for $0, which is benign neglect. So, why is this not what am I missing here that it's not an option to just say maybe we'll maintain the road until there's a 25-year storm or a 100-year storm and it's blown open, and then we say, okay, no more road. Or if it's less damage, you say, it's a pedestrian road now.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly one option. I guess, we've seen a lot of gravel that's in each of those floods where the road's been overtopped, get carried into the wetland, and it'd be if that was your objective for full restoration, it'd be better to do it in a programmed way. It's kind of what we're saying. So you don't.
My other question is, we've talked a little bit about doing multiple of the smaller or at least cheaper things, and I like that idea too. But some of them strike me as potentially redundant. Even the A and B that we're looking at, because the the bench cut makes sense when there is one main artery for the water. And if you put in big culverts, there's no longer one main artery for the water. So where between those two, or between the 11, when we say we'd like to shop around for a combination, what are the combinations to avoid because they're redundant?
Yeah, that's a big question. I wouldn't say there's no benefit of the bench cut by, you could put those two together. It's still the main artery. And in fact, it's a pretty small fraction of the flow that's being distributed through the other culverts relative to the bridge. So the bench cut still has merit even with that and others. Now, it's a good question, perhaps deserves some thought about combinations. So yes, you've been very patient.
I just was wondering if you could speak at all to the invasiveness of each of the three options. It is like a wildlife preservation area, and I'm curious if you have any opinions on how invasive these three options would be.
Yeah.
I mean, I think as far as disturbing areas that have more habitat function and value right now, the bench cut would be the one that ranks worse of the three. You know, the other two are culvert replacements in a road, and your work area is basically confined to an area that's already a road, so you're not really, you know, creating more impact on either side of the road or the wetlands.
Yeah.
And whereas the bench cut, you really have to think carefully about how you're going to access the area that you're trying to establish the bench cut in, trying to avoid mature vegetation wherever you can, excavate the material that you're planning to excavate, and then make as effective an exit out of the work area without spilling impacts all over the place. So the bench cut, unfortunately, but I mean, there's ways of doing this where, you know, you seed, you know, any bare soil after you're done, and you're starting your work, you know, you're planning your work at times of the year when you know the flows are going to be pretty low, and you keep an eye on the weather forecast and try to pick a window where there's no major weather event coming. So there's ways of maximizing or minimizing the risk that you're going to be creating impact that you're not wishing to create. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is where the bench cut is proposed is an area that was farmed for a really long time, and even though it's naturally vegetated, there's very few shrubs in there right now, and so it is an impacted area already too. So it's not like we're walking into a beautiful alder swamp and destroying a bunch of happy plants to get to the other side where we want to do something. It's sort of a reasonable amount of impact to create something that is more functional and valuable as far as habitat. Yeah, and then removing the road I don't see, you know, the balance of that is also like your footprint of the work is really removing the fill from the road, and it's not like we're leaving bare soil behind, you know, this is all going to be seeded. I'm sorry?
There's already a road to the work site.
Right. So the access is very straightforward. You come in from either end, and then you start from the middle and just peel everything back. So the logistics of that are pretty simple.
But you lose the road.
That is not
That's
simple.
the point.
Yes.
Yeah.
On the wildlife thing, you know, Sand Hill Road is a place for recreation, wildlife viewing, bird watching, whatnot. I'm understanding that the culvert option, they're being set lower, but they're not. I'm not thinking about the floodplain times. I'm just thinking about a normal, sunny, beautiful day. Mm-hmm. Is that actually changing the hydrology? Is it going to be drying out the northwestern side of the road because the culvert will be lower? And obviously beavers are going to do what beavers do, which is one of the beauties of Sand Hill Road is every year it's different. So I'm curious about how this culvert option in particular would affect habitat and water flow on the non-flood events.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And right now, 2 of the culverts are carrying flow very frequently. I mean, every time I've been here, which has been a handful of days, but every time I've come, culvert number 4 is carrying flow across, and so is 3, I think. So even in their perched state, there's water coming across under base flow conditions. So if you set the new culverts lower, they're going to be carrying flow under base flood conditions as well.
And does your models have a specific proposal of where to set that culvert already? Or is that something that would then be the actual engineering firm that designs and permits?
Yeah, I mean, setting the design elevations we picked for these model runs are basically trying to match the floodplain on either side of the road. That's about as far as we went with setting these elevations. So I think a lot more effort into really thinking about that would be worth doing. I mean, I have a feeling that overall, yes, probably the north side of the road is gonna not be as ponded as it is currently, just because you have more conveyance going across the road. But I think a lot of that flow is just groundwater flow and smaller tributaries that come in from the west side of the valley that are sort of coming down the higher elevations, crossing under Westminster Road, kind of making its way to the toe of the valley, and then slowly seeping downstream southward, you know, probably hugging that side of the valley.
So it's less Sackett's Brook itself.
Yeah, it's more this groundwater-based flow that's continuously being fed and then carried across the road and then further on downstream. So I think my general feeling is that it might be drier on the north side of the road, but I think you're not going to lose the wetland habitat. There's always going to be the supply of these smaller tributaries and seeps, and there's going to be enough water there that it's going to keep the... It might be a slightly different type of wetland. It might be more shrubby than emergent herbaceous wetland. Yeah.
VRC in the back, all the way.
Sure. So you were talking, actually, back up. First, I just think it's really exciting that the town is considering 3 alternatives that are all aimed at restoring hydrology to some measure. Between those 3 alternatives, one thing I was thinking about more is vegetation and how vegetation changes over time. So you had mentioned, improving roughness, for example, like giving the water something to lose some of its energy against as it's moving. But also certainly increased uptake of water, depending on what vegetation exists there. Increased infiltration of water with the reconnected floodplain. I was just wondering if you could give us any guidance for thinking about those 3 alternatives through the lens of how vegetation communities might change as we implement them.
Yeah, I feel like this is somewhat related to the question that was asked right before, where, if we're changing the conveyance of water across this area under base flow, how is the habitat going to change? And so, we're removing an obstacle to water flow, so the areas to the north are going to be slightly drier, and the areas to the south are going to be slightly wetter on average, I would think. So ponded areas to the north might develop into more shrubby wetlands that take up more water. There's more evapotranspiration, more habitat for birds, even beavers. There's the whole beaver. I mean, once you remove the road, then the beavers are just going to take over, and then, that's sort of like nature is taking its own course there.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting to us, I think, in a visit last fall, and I encourage you, if you haven't walked that whole southwestern end of the study area we're talking about, where the hydrology would be improved, is that the old Sackettsburg Channel is indistinguishable from the floodplain. So it's like, where did it go? And you see all this vegetation out there that is wetland vegetation, but the hydrology really isn't there nearly as much to support it. So it's very clear, like Sackett's, rolling off on the other side of the valley to the east has really changed the hydrology. And so, I think that vegetation having more hydrology by allowing more to go through the road on the west side is going to make it, as you said, more robust over time and kind of reinvigorate that wetland vegetative community, which would be good for everything that we're talking about, all the objectives. So. Did you have a comment on that?
No, I had a different question.
Yeah.
We haven't talked at all about lowering a section of the road. That would be instead of putting culverts in, I assume.
Correct.
And it depending on how you did it, could allow a whole lot of water through. And if you made a concrete section, maybe it wouldn't be damaged by a flood.
Correct.
Or at least not as much as a culvert or a bridge might be. But it seems like it's been rejected either by the different committees that have looked at it. Are there disadvantages to it? It seems like there might, something that only flooded during a major flood and wasn't damaged by the flood might be an advantage.
Yeah, and there are, this is a strategy that's been used by others. There are some models out there, either lowering roads or lowering old railroad causeways, to allow water to flow over them and spread the water out more and to get multiple benefits. And there's actually particular engineered manufactured products out there, articulated concrete and things that would actually, serve the purpose to allow, a travelable surface, but also an area that where fast-moving floodwaters could flow over and not damage, that surface.
It's also cheaper.
It is substantially cheaper, yeah, and you still have a road.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm trying to remember to what detail, Rodrigue, you looked into this with the modeling.
Yeah, we did. And I will say it's quite effective in terms of flood resiliency, but it doesn't do a whole lot for habitat.
Right, because it doesn't allow any water through under normal circumstances,
yeah.
Unless you leave the current culverts, and then so it doesn't improve the situation.
Right, yeah. Right. Yeah, because enlarging the culverts or adding a squash culvert really increases the hydrological connectivity between the two sides of the road.
Right.
Which might dry out the north side of the road a little bit, but increases hydrology to the south side, which is good for the wetland. Yeah, so you're addressing flood resiliency, so it would be effective at that. But there's probably maintenance associated with that practice too. It's not going to be foolproof for any kind of flood.
I wonder if one of the reasons that was knocked down was because when we talked about reasons not to take out the road, it's for not just normal access, but EMS access, and in particular, you want that when you've got a hurricane or whatever. And so if Kimball Hill is closed and you look to your backup EMS access, well, there's 3 feet of water across it. So there's limited utility maybe. I had another question about mix and match things. If the town does 2 or 3 things, like the lowering of the road and more culverts, or A and B, do we generally get a bulk discount where you can have your assessments all done together and your excavation all done together and the price goes down?
Yeah. There are efficiencies certainly in mobilizing equipment and that sort of thing. Yeah, if you bundled a bunch, you'd probably get some efficiencies and discounts. How about 3 more questions, and then I did say we'd stay here as long as you'd like. We are approaching 9. I'm sure some of us would like to go home. Yeah.
So, just a quick comment on the southwest quadrant that both from direct observation and drone footage that the Wetlands Committee paid for a number of years ago. You're right with you're looking at the historic photographs, and the stream basically disappeared south of Sand Hill Road when it historically turned towards the west. It just turned into a bunch of diffuse, very small channels, very shallow channels. So I did have a quick question. If we can go on to somebody else's, but if there's time and you have the inclination to come back to this, just wondering what some of the effect of this would be on the northwest quadrant, because west of the bridge and north of the road, because it seems like the ground level has risen as the brook itself has excised its bed and gone down, and with the perching of the culverts, it seems like silting and sedimentation has raised the ground level of that. So just wondering if that is an issue we should be concerned about going forward in terms of further reducing access to the floodplain. You know, it seems to me like it's on its way to becoming a beaver meadow on that site. So I just wonder, do we need to be thinking about that in all of this?
Well, I think adding more conveyance and bigger conveyances to that west of the bridge is going to help that out. You know, it's pretty intuitive. But yeah, no, it's an interesting comment. We'd expect material to build up behind, especially with those perched culverts, and you really see it out there today. The flow patterns, meaning like if you stood out there tomorrow, maybe you have in the past couple of days, you can see where the water, hits Sand Hill Road in a higher flow, turns, I'm talking about the northwest quadrant, hits the road, turns, and zooms toward the bridge. There's actually a bunch of scour happening. The guardrails falling in that corner of the bridge because the water is rushing along, the edge of the road at a high velocity. So it's going fast there, but it's going slow as it approaches and slowing because of those perch culverts and hitting the obstruction, which is the road. So as velocity decreases, the sediments that the water is carrying fall out of the water column. So that's a natural process. We'd expect that building up. And I hadn't thought about, it's sort of, as you build that up, the elevation difference between the floodplain and the road is decreasing. So the likelihood that, the water could get up and over the road is, you're sort of, you got a negative effect there. And like you said, the floodplain elevation's higher, so it's growing perhaps more disconnected from the channel. So certainly something to keep an eye on. I think the multiple culverts would help that. Yeah. Yes.
I'd just like to say I've lived here forever, and meaning I was born here, meaning that road has always been there. There's always been a pond and a habitat, and it's always been used for multiple reasons, emergencies. Most recently, even on Halloween, they route people that way. If school gets out early and all the kids are at school, how do they get to East Putney? If there's anything going on in town, do they go over Patch Road on a snowy day, or do they go down and get on the interstate and get off in Bellas Falls? there's like a million reasons not to close that road. And there's probably a million ways you can fix what you want to fix without doing it.
Thank you for that
Is this a
comment.
point where we should get a sense of the remaining audience about that particular issue or the other two options? The other thing is Mary has prepared a lot of comment cards, and that she mentioned you could drop off at Town Hall later on in the lockbox just outside the door, or you can leave them here tonight. But out of this meeting, it would be nice, we're getting a general sense of things, but I think if you could do that, at least a comment card. Do we want to ask how many people would be for closing Sand Hill Road?
I think we should, they're hydrologists, not traffic engineers. Like, let's keep
Okay,
quick. I do have a hydrology question. So
I'm sorry. I just would like to get a sense of the crowd, so if you would fill out the comment cards, that would be great.
We can go into the yellow,
And we're gonna let people still out their forms.
Yeah, how about we
Did you spend any time in the upper watershed? And were all of your analysis of the upper watershed mainly just by GIS and satellite imagery? And is there anything that you noticed in the upper watershed that'd be like, hey, this is actually, like one of the options is work with upper watershed landowners, but it's very vague.
Yeah.
I'm curious about if anything popped out as an area of concern or an area of potential resiliency.
No, we didn't look very much on the upper sections of the watershed. You know, we were concentrated in the study area. So what I know of those parts of the watershed is just satellite imagery, GIS, computer-based. I think the comment that you're referencing is there's a number of smaller streams coming in from Westminster Road. And my thought there is that there's quite a bit of pressure on these small streams as far as encroachment on the banks and the vegetation being very managed, and maybe there's some activities that could be happening to increase the riparian buffers and
it's
things.
generally steep terrain.
Right.
Water
Yeah.
moves fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that Rodrigo and Evan have been very generous in staying way over time, and they need to drive to Colchester, Vermont tonight. So we want to give them.
Well, thank you all. That was great interest from you all. We appreciate all your comments and questions. So let us know, read the report, let us know if you have any more.
We look forward to your final
Yeah.
report.
All right, thank you all.